If anything can concisely summarize the present predicament facing New Zealand, it's this single number: 73,852. In the 12 months leading up to August 2025, 73,852 Kiwis emigrated. In other words, 73,852 is the number of Kiwis that packed their bags and booked one-way tickets out of the isolated island nation to build a new life somewhere else. Broken down, that's 202 people a day, nearly enough to fill an Air New Zealand A321 aircraft. More than doubling the number of Kiwis lost in both world wars, or ranking as the country's 9th largest if it were a city, this number by itself is a major concern. Making the problem only more glaring is that more than a third of those leaving are aged 18 to 30 years old. Making the problem only more structural, long-term emigration by New Zealand citizens has been steadily rising for more than a decade. From 2015 to 2025, the cumulative total is at 454,000, a number larger than all New Zealand cities aside from Auckland. 73,852 is not a fluke, but rather a sign of the times. Now, there are plenty of theories informing why Kiwis are leaving, but simply consider where this diaspora is headed and a clearer picture takes shape: Australia. With the vast majority of these departures headed across the Tasman Sea, it's the recently established, extremely close relationship between these two countries that's sitting at the center of this developing demographic disaster. Across the entire English-speaking world, even within the core 5 nations of the Anglosphere, the US, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand, all of which sharing British heritage, democratic structures, and close economic relationships, no two nations are nearly as culturally, politically, and economically aligned as Australia and New Zealand. Culturally, just as an unaccustomed outsider may confuse an American and a Canadian, because they sound similar, they listen to mostly the same music, they both watch the same professional sports leagues that span the two nations, an outsider may do the same with a Kiwi and an Aussie. They're both likely to care about rugby, they're both probably proud of their pavlova desserts, they share a lot of popular culture, and they too sound similar to the untrained ear. But culture only acts as the visible surface level of the closeness between the two countries. If a New Zealand citizen wants to visit Australia, no problem. All one needs is a passport. Again, not so different from the US-Canada experience. But if that same Kiwi wants to stay for a while and work, again, no problem. They just need a passport. Should they want to live in the country for a while, well, that's fine too. Just a passport. Only until a Kiwi wants to begin being considered for state benefits does a visa come into question. And should they eventually decide they want to become a citizen, they simply need to be present in the country for 4 years and a full-time resident for 1. In fact, flipping between the two and becoming a citizen is seen as such a small deal in the scheme of things that a note on the government website asks those pursuing citizenship to make sure that they aren't already, by law, an Australian without knowing it. For Aussies and Kiwis, it's easier to work and move between the two than it is for a Canadian and an American, and it's easier to become a naturalized citizen than it is for anyone moving between countries in the EU. This unique closeness carries over to business, too. Whereas trade across the US-Canada border is paperwork intensive, increasingly politicized, and subject to tariffs, business between New Zealand and Australia functions almost as if there's no border at all. Working towards a fully integrated international economic understanding called the Single Economy Market, trade and business relations between the two resemble what you'd see across American states or the UK without the historical baggage that may inform how a Scot thinks of a Brit. Whether it's relocating, naturalizing, working, or doing business, there's really no two large, developed countries outside Europe where the movement between them is as seamless. All this is relatively new. In the 1890s, the 6 British colonies comprising present-day Australia began the process of coming together as a country. An Australian national identity had begun to develop, concerns over defense had heightened, and frustrations over the economic inefficiencies of not having a single national market for foods and services had become too much. At the first of a series of conferences hammering out the details, New Zealand sent delegates. At home, they began floating the idea of joining this developing Commonwealth. Ultimately, though, they chose not to. And while much is often made of the fact that Australia's 1901 constitution ultimately left room for New Zealand to join, less is made of the fact that they didn't want to. Their own independently governed colony with a fruitful trade relationship with Britain, New Zealanders believe their culture to be too different, their policies towards Indigenous people too incongruous with Australia's, and their economies not yet potential allies but rather export rivals. For much of the early 1900s, New Zealand maintained its distance from Australia and benefited from it. With the aid of refrigerated shipping, a temperate climate ideal for animal husbandry, and a wildly prosperous trade relationship with the ever resource-hungry Britain, the New Zealand economy, on the back of raw agricultural exports, soared. By the 1950s, by GDP per capita, New Zealand had become the world's third most productive, prosperous economy. But then came the 60s, and with it change in the form of synthetic wool and Britain entering the European Economic Community. Suddenly, a one-trick pony economy had to diversify. New Zealand built factories, it explored exporting to other markets like the US and Asia, it expanded state services, and ultimately, it faltered. In the age of global liberalization, of Reagan and Thatcher, New Zealand underwent its own process of difficult right-sizing through Rogernomics. By this point, in the 1980s, Australia's economy had surpassed the productivity of New Zealand's for good, and with few other promising options, New Zealand came to the table with their neighbor to figure out a trade relationship that would mirror those taking shape in Europe. First came the Closer Economic Relations Agreement in 1983. With tariffs and quantified restrictions between the two countries phased out, a new trading partnership bloomed, growing by 500% over 20 years. It was a watershed moment. The fruitful agreement was taken further. In 1998, the two agreed that products that passed inspection and testing and became legally available to consumers in one country could now be sold in the other without any questions asked. This was then extended to the workforce. Anyone who obtained licensure in most any field in one country was able to perform the same work in the other. The relationship was further crystallized with the Single Economic Market Agreement of 2009. This has made it even easier for businesses to work across the Tasman Sea by setting up trans-Tasman regulatory bodies and essentially turning the hard borders between the two countries into something closer resembling ever-permeable dotted lines. For both nations, coming together in a time of real uncertainty in the 1980s has been a major success and stabilizing factor. But recently for New Zealand, it's begun to show some difficult downsides. What's killing New Zealand is that such a permeable border between two nations is allowing Australia's gravitational pull to impact New Zealand's population. There are two simple metrics that inform the critical differences between the two countries: population and GDP per capita. At 27.2 million people, Australia is about 5 times the size of New Zealand, and in GDP per capita, Australia is at 12th in the world with $66,000 US, while New Zealand lags behind at 25th with $49,000 US. These two gulfs have real consequences for New Zealand. Just take any Auckland kid about to make a decision on where to go to college, for example. Because the two nations are now so closely tethered, any graduating Kiwi has the opportunity to cross the Tasman and study in Australia without a student visa while paying the domestic rate for university rather than the international fee. Of course, it should be said, the same exists for an Aussie looking toward New Zealand. But let's say a student from either of these countries is looking for a bigger campus with a larger range of paths of study. In New Zealand, there are 6 universities that boast a student body over 20,000, with the University of Auckland far and away the largest with 45,000 students. In just the Australian state of Victoria, there are 7 such universities. In New South Wales, another 9. And should this student be a high achiever, it's 4 Australian universities versus 0 New Zealand schools cracking the US News Top 50 list, and it's not until number 10 before you find a New Zealand university in the top regional universities across the two countries. For a prospective student, Australia just provides more opportunities, and for the high achiever, more prestigious pathways. Furthering the hypothetical, let's say this post-college student is interested in getting into investment banking. In Sydney, there's the big international names. There's Goldman Sachs, there's Morgan Stanley right across the street, right below it is UBS, and a few blocks down there's JP Morgan. There are also offices of Barclays, Citibank, and Bank of America. In Auckland, there's barely any investment banking. While Citibank does technically have a presence with an office here, banking of any sort in New Zealand is dominated by ANZ, ASB, Bank of New Zealand, and Westpac New Zealand, 3 of which are subsidiaries of banks in Australia, the 4th originally founded in New South Wales. So, should someone want to get into investment banking, their best bet would be to attend a university within the collection of the Group of 8, the region's most selective universities, all of which located in Australia, then head to Sydney. For banking or anything finance related, it just makes sense to base operations out of Australia as the infrastructure already exists, the currency is more international, the market's just bigger. While intuitive, this in turn stunts any potential development for New Zealand's financial industry, as it just makes far more sense to simply go to Australia and quite potentially never come back. Now, in New Zealand's culture, it may not be the end of the world to be losing its finance bros, but losing their tax dollars and their subsequent local spending costs the nation's economy. This trend exists beyond the finance and white-collar hypotheticals, too. In 2021, this advertisement ran in the New Zealand Herald. Sponsored by the state of Queensland, they were looking to pull registered nurses across the ditch to fill vacancies across a host of facilities with the promise that the state had reasonable working conditions, livable cities, and warm weather. The timing was opportunistic, as New Zealand healthcare workers had gone on protest just a month earlier demanding better working conditions and pay. Those who followed the advertisement west reported back that the jobs lived up to the promise. They had fewer patients per nurse, and they got paid better. By March of 2024, of the 38,000 nurses registered in Australia that year, 10,000 hailed from New Zealand. With such asymmetrical opportunity in education and employment, New Zealand is hemorrhaging able workers in a classic case of brain drain. The country is able to raise middle and high-income workers, but is increasingly unable to keep them, their skills, and their dollars at home. Of course, with such open borders and similar cultures, people go both ways. Australians invest their time and money in New Zealand too, but it looks different. On average, if an Australian is planning to go to New Zealand, it's either to visit, to retire, or to check on their real estate investments. All of which brings money across the Tasman, but money that does less to grow the economy and money that has a complicated impact on the nation's direction. Tourism, for instance, is a major part of the New Zealand economy. It employs some 10% of the population, at least indirectly. It accounts for about 7.5% of the nation's GDP, and with between a third and half of all tourists hailing from Australia, the entire industry relies on its neighbors to keep it afloat. In a place like Queenstown, with beautiful waterways abutted by dramatic snow-capped mountains, tourism does an amazing job of commercializing what would otherwise be some pretty inhospitable landscapes. In this way, tourism does a lot for a rather rugged and rocky nation. The thing is, tourism's a difficult industry to turn into a career. One can work at one of the 2 ski resorts near Queenstown, but it's only a seasonal job from June to October. It's a job that won't likely require a degree, and one that will count on young, adventure-oriented employees and thus will not pay well. The same limitations will go for a raft guide, a luxury hotel employee, a server at the popular restaurant in the heart of town. Employment will probably be seasonal, pay will be at the whims of visitation trends well beyond their control, jobs will perpetually remain entry-level, career advancement will be limited, and benefits will be non-existent. Australians will come visit, spend their money, stimulate the economy for the moment, but ultimately perpetuate a system with fairly limited long-term viability. The same goes with Australians that make the move permanent, those that retire there. While they're moving in, stimulating the real estate market, spending their disposable funds at local businesses, they're bringing little to the table when it comes to growing the country's economic output, benefiting its age pyramid, and simply by buying into the market, only making the housing crisis just a touch worse for the average Kiwi. What's easy to lose sight of when considering New Zealand and Australia is that while they're both extremely isolated island nations, one is far smaller and more isolated than the other. That informs some important push factors. If Kiwis are pulled to Australia, they're also pushed by the fact that life is just generally more expensive and less convenient. For a lot of products, New Zealand's status on the very edge of global trade routes doesn't matter too much. Take imported Twinings tea or Cadbury chocolate bars. They're fairly similar priced in both Australia and New Zealand, and when compared to those available in the US, they're actually cheaper. Global shipping has figured products like this out. They're shelf-stable, small, easy to handle, and thus cheap to move and cheap to buy. But when there are blips in this system, New Zealand's far more likely to lose out. Take a fresher and more difficult product, orange juice. In 2024, orange juice prices started to rise at every Kiwi's local Woolworths, then the cartons began to disappear entirely. This was on account of a faraway cyclone in Brazil that set the global orange juice supply behind on account of a lack of oranges. In Australia, though, the shortage was minimized by the fact that there's a fairly strong orange industry domestically, a benefit of the country spanning 3 climate zones from arid to tropical. Even in things that New Zealand is well equipped to produce, goods are expensive. Take beef. If a Kiwi is going to buy ground beef, it's going to be largely at the global going rate, as beef is a major export for the country. That means when beef is in tight demand and the market rate rises globally, for Kiwis to entice New Zealand producers to sell locally, they have to roughly match the rate. Buying beef at the international rate, though, is expensive for the average New Zealander because their purchasing power is hamstrung by a less and less productive economy. By monthly cost of living, which considers everything from rent to grocery bills, New Zealand's in the world's top 25 most expensive, while by purchasing power parity, New Zealand's at 36th, near countries where the price of living is much lower. No matter how much a Kiwi may love their home country, this massive disparity between purchasing power and price of living is crippling. It's simply a massively difficult place to make ends meet. While Australia is even more expensive on a cost of living basis, its PPP ranking is a whole 40 spots higher. Rent will be higher, but so will wages and earning potential. Increasingly, as more and more Australian companies come to establish important holdings and provide important services in New Zealand, whether it's the banks, the grocery stores like Woolworths and Coles, the gas stations like Ampol, or the food distributor Goodman Fielder, and as more New Zealanders look to access opportunity and the wider world through moving to Australia, the relationship between the two feels less and less equal. It feels not like the interaction between two sovereign, self-interested countries, and more so the interaction of a far-flung, down-on-its-luck state and the prosperous nation within which it resides. On balance, the softening of borders between Australia and New Zealand seems to benefit the former far more than the latter. Australia receives access to new markets, a host of hungry young professionals, and a beautiful and convenient destination to travel. New Zealand, in turn, has an important economic ally, a market to send its goods, and an army of tourists to pump at least some money into the country. It's an uneven agreement, and one that's costing New Zealand far more than it's costing Australia. It's an imbalance informed by size and geography beyond the control of either. But it's ultimately an imbalanced deal that likely isn't going anywhere soon. Ask a Kiwi, and they're not likely to harbor any bitterness towards Australia and this imbalance of benefits. Ask a New Zealand politician and you'll get much the same. There's little to no animosity toward the nation taking some of its best and brightest. Immigration is a real problem, but immigration is a consequence of a deal that New Zealand relies on. Remove Australia from the equation, and New Zealand is only in more trouble, more isolated, and left with fewer prospects. A colonial enterprise from the beginning, New Zealand is a global nation with global ambitions, and to act on such ambitions as the most isolated major nation in the world comes with real trade-offs. Trade-offs and difficult decisions, though, should not be defining your shaving routine. Far too long in my own life, I've had to weigh the decision between growing out some stubble or inevitably irritating my skin with any and every razor that just seemed to maul my face and always make the routine an unpleasant one. But all that changed when I gave Henson Shaving, the sponsor of this video, a try. For years I've used razors that could give me a fine enough, close, clean-looking shave, but not until I gave Henson a shot did they actually feel good. That's because Henson has been designing around the feel and experience of the shave, as well as the look, and they've come up with the Henson razor. These are made in an aerospace machine shop, they're all aluminum, and everything from the angle of the razor blade to its blade support was designed to turn shaving from an irritating hassle into just another part of your morning routine. In a space where marketing gimmicks, subscription models, and a whole lot of plastic waste has become the norm, Henson has quietly innovated, and my mornings are better because of it. If you'd like to give their product a shot and support a company that's supporting us, head to hensonshaving.com/Wendover and enter Wendover at checkout to get 100 free blades with your purchase. It's a switch that I really think you're going to appreciate making.